Okay, in this tutorial, what we're going to walk through is creating a displacement map from a base image that we are going to displace a graphic or distort a graphic or texture on this using the base as a displacement map. So for this particular image, I want to apply a different texture to this woman's face, but I'm going to use this image of the woman and a channel, one of the colored channels, as an alpha channel to create a displacement map so I can curve and contour that texture so it seems like it's wrapping around her face more than just overlaying a graphic and changing the transparency. Because as we saw in the previous tutorial, displacement maps can, stretch and push graphics based on the contour and gray values in those channels. So the first thing you want to do, since we want to isolate her face from the rest of her body, is you want to make a selection of her face. So we have a number of selection tutorials that you can review. So you have your marquee tools, your lasso tools, your quick select tool, your magic wand tool, using channels to do selections. So use whatever method you see fit and then make a selection of her face. Once you make a selection of her face, you can go to the Select Save Selection menu and go through that whole process to save your selection to the Channels panel like I've already done. So just to speed things up, I already did that. And I have my face selection selected. So to activate a selection from the Channels panel, you can just hold down the Command key and click on the thumbnail, and then it will activate that selection. Since we already did that, I'm just going to deselect that because now I have that in my Channels panel to use for later. Okay, so now what we need to do is create a displacement map. So this is the part basically where we were after we made that radial gradient on the ellipse. Now we're going to make a displacement map from this file. But as opposed to the gradient, which actually acts as a displacement map, this we have to find one because this is not in grayscale. So where do you find that? You can go to your channels panel. If I click on my red channel, you can see I have those gray values, white, black, and gray values that would help create a level of displacement along this woman's face. So what you do before creating a displacement map is you evaluate the channels to find the channel that has the broadest range of contrast. Now, that being said, technically any of these channels can work as a displacement map because you are capable of modifying a channel after you duplicate it into a new document. So we want to look at these that would give us the best starting point. So if I look at the red channel, notice I have some really dark darks and then I have some really light whites. This gives me the biggest contrast range from white to dark, and then I can modify it using levels and other adjustments to make it a little bit stronger contrast. So let's start with the red channel. Once you've found a channel that you want to use as your displacement map, you go up to the panel menu and do Duplicate Channel. That will open up the Duplicate Channel dialog box. From the Duplicate Channel dialog box, you'd come to the Document window and click on the drop-down menu and select New, because we want to make a new document that is going to be our displacement map off of this alpha channel. So I'm going to call this Face Displace, and just in case I was going to make multiple displacement maps to test, I'm going to do underscore and red so that I know that this came from the red channel. And if I plan to modify it, I can even type in the word modify, but that would be something that you determine after you modify it. So I press OK. Once I press OK, it opens up a new document. So I know there was no change on my screen, but that's just because I have my red channel selected in my other file. So they look the same, but this channel is my full file with my composite. But then if I go back to my face displace red, notice all it is a file with an alpha channel. If you go up to your image and mode menu, notice it is not a bitmap or grayscale file. It is a multi-channel file. So it is just an alpha channel, okay? Just those gray values. So from this face displace red file, now I can make my modifications to it. So what I want to do is use my image adjustment commands. So there's key commands for those, but if I go to my image and adjustment menu, you notice I have brightness, contrast, I have levels and curves. The two we're going to be working the most with for now is levels or curves. Curves and levels do the same thing, but levels is a little bit easier to use, a little more broad, whereas curves allows you to do a lot more nuanced tonal adjustments. So to keep things simple, let's use our levels. So we go to the levels panel and notice I have my histogram with my black point, gray point, and white point. I just said those backwards, but that's okay, you get it. So what I can do is increase the contrast of this image by bringing my black point. So since I'm just concentrated on the face, I'm just going to be taking a look at those areas. So whatever's happened to the background and her chest, I don't really care because I'm just going to be displacing a texture to her face. So I bring in my black point to the edge of the shadows. That way I know things aren't dipping too far into black because remember, I'm only going to go displaced beyond black. So anything beyond black doesn't make a difference. And then for the white point, remember white displaces in the opposite direction. So you can leave it off a little bit if you wanted to back off of the displacement, or you can bring it all the way up to the edge of the white point or redefine a new white point. So if I want a major displacement on the tip of her nose or her cheekbones, I could bring it way up so that I know values are going to be pulled into her cheeks to make it look like it's wrapping over her cheekbone. So it really depends, once you get your displacement map set, how much movement you want happening over a curve. And remember, if we just look at our values, we can determine where those things are going to happen. And then again, I can use my gray point slider to modify midtones. So bring up the shadow depth a little bit, or bring up the shadows, and then have highlight and shadow, so my midtones fall more on the cheekbones, then I have whites on the cheeks. So you can take your time modifying the levels adjustment, and then when you're done, you can press OK. Now, here's the tricky thing about displacement maps. When we were using the gradient in the previous tutorial, the gradients were nice, smooth, and soft. But if I do Command 1 or actual pixels on this graphic and zoom in, notice there's a lot of black and white detail along the inner pores of her skin, because this is a pretty decent photo. But if I wanted this to be a smooth displacement, the displacement map is going to be able to read those little gray values and the black values inside pores and certain cracks and pixel information. So to smooth things out, you can use a number of different filters, but two primary filters I'm used to using. If you go to your filter menu, you can go to noise and median, and this softens pixels, or you can go to blur and Gaussian blur. And then what this does, let's try median first. If we click on median, this basically softens the radius around a certain relationship of pixels. So it will soften those pixels to create more smoother gradients. Now you can see this is more relative to that gradient displacement map we created in the previous tutorial. So in this one, I'm going to bring it down a little bit because I just want to soften the gradients. I don't want to totally remove detail because that's going to help my displacement map look realistic, but 10 is a little overdoing it. So I'll stick around 6 or 7, but again, you can change these based on your needs if you want to redo the displacement map. Press OK. So let's say median softened out the radius, but you needed to do a little bit more blurring. I can do that with the blur filter. So I'll come up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and this one I'm probably not going to need too much either. You can see the differences as you move the slider, so I'll bring it way up so you can see blurring there. So I'm going to take mine down, to about 3.5, I think. So there you go. I've softened out the edges of the pixels. Now I did an overall softening of the entire graphic. So now I have a pretty smooth transition between gray values, some white values on the tip of her nose, dark values in her mouth. And again, I can open up my levels panel again and maybe darken some of the blacks in the mouth if I wanted to. But let's give this displacement map a try for now. So now once I've made all my adjustments, I can do Command-Shift-S to save my document as a map. So I'm going to go to my displacement maps folder in this particular document file. And then it's already called Face Displace Red, so I don't even need to change the file name. If it makes it more clear for you, you can add map on the end in case it's just not so clear based on the naming convention you use for your main document. And notice Alpha Channels is checked, Photoshop document format checked by default, and then press Save. So now I have this file as my displacement map. I can keep it open to make modifications and reuse it or resave it, or I can close it and then just reference it through the Displace Filter dialog box. So let's go back to our regular document where we're going to use that map we just created. Once you come back to your regular document, remember we left off where we were on the red channel, so you got to click back and go back to your RGB composite or do Command 2. And that brings you back to home base. Okay, so now we're ready to add our texture. So in this case, you'd be going to online sources, whether it be stock images, to find, there's many places all over the internet where you can find royalty-free, reuse with modification textures where you can purchase, buy lower or get lower resolution textures for free and that sort of thing. So they're all over the internet. So I'm not going to go too far into that, but I picked out a few textures. I'm just going to use one for the tutorial because we did all 3 in class, and I'll just discuss the options for the other 3. So what you do is go to File, Place Embed, and then you can go to your resource folder in your folder management where you saved all of your textures that you saved. So I'm going to use this white texture that we used in lecture and then do place. And so remember, if I didn't change my defaults of Photoshop, whenever I place a graphic into Photoshop, it gives me the ability to transform and scale and rotate or reposition. So I'm just going to put this texture over her face. And then when I commit to it, it automatically converts that layer to a smart object. And remember what we said in the previous tutorial, smart objects are good because then it gives us a smart filter, and then we can have Displace as a smart filter. So once I have that, excuse me, that texture in place, I can work about this in two different ways. I can apply my layer mask from my selection, or I can apply the Displace filter and then apply the layer mask. Doesn't really matter. But let's do the layer mask first, just so that we can see this filter, make sure it's in its right place, or this texture, make sure it's in the right place. So I go up to Select, Load Selection, choose the channel from my load selection menu. So there's my face selection, and press OK. Or I could just simply Command-click on my channels panel, but some of you may not have that open. Those are two different ways of doing it. It gives my selection. I have my smart object selected, and then I press Add Layer Mask. So there you go. I have my nice selection where I've done the refine edge, so her hairs have been ignored, so I have the fuzziness of her hairs, and it gets softer near the ears. I didn't clean up the ear section just for case of pace, and then there's some feathering around the chin that I'll probably have to clean up anyway, but just did that pretty quickly just so we have a decent size mask to work with. Then, since with displacement maps, I may want to move this texture around, I'm going to unlink my layer mask from my smart object, okay? Just so they have the ability to transform, rotate, or reposition my texture, because sometimes you need to do that with displacement. So then I'm going to go up to my filter menu, distort, and displace. So we're familiar with this menu now. So I'm going to leave it at its defaults, and I'm going to press OK. 1010 is the default. Press OK. And then, excuse me, I'm going to go to my Displace Filter demo, and then go to my Displacement Maps folder, and there's my Face Displace Red map. And then I'm going to select that, and then press Open. It'll take a minute to adjust that. And then you can see there's been a little bit of displacement, but we haven't done our blending modes yet. Oh, did I not? Oh, wait a minute. I may have done that on my layer mask. I thought I selected my smart object. Let me select my smart object, then go to Filter and Displace. Sorry, I Command Z out of that. And distort and displace. 10. Grab my displace map, and then press Open. If you guys just unchecked everything, there we go. That looks a little different. I don't know if it messed it up or not, but I just wanted to make sure and redo that. So make sure your smart object is selected, not your layer mask, and apply the displace filter. Probably did it correctly, but just don't like messing with that too much. Okay, so now you can see there's been displacement on it, both negative and positive, because of the variance in her skin tones from that displacement map. And then I can go to Normal, and I'm going to go to Overlay. So when I click Overlay, you can see right there. Basic defaults of Photoshop, 1010. I'm like 80% in the pocket with this displacement map. Okay, so I have positive displacements. It's moving the lines up in the white values, moving the lines down in the darker gray values, and then when we get to the black, it significantly shifts the values around her face. But then if you see, if I do Command 1 and zoom into actual pixels, you can see even though I used a quick mask and the refine edge, I have a decent feathering around the edge, but if I was at 100% in print, that may not be too acceptable because I have, almost a noisy edge to my layer mask there. So I'd go to my layer mask and clean that up with a brush tool, a custom brush, or do refine mask. There's several ways of doing that. But just to keep things simple, I'm going to leave it as is, but we do want to clean up around our eyes. So I'm going to click on my layer mask, grab my default brush tool, decrease the size a little bit, hit my D key for my defaults, put my X in the foreground, and then I can simply paint away the displacement map that is over her eyes. And actually, I'm going to go up here. Do I have any different ones? Oh, I'll just use a soft round. That's fine. Just to give myself a little feathered edge around her eyelids. And then come over to this side and clean up her eye there because she wouldn't necessarily have this paper texture over her eye. And actually, this particular texture works okay on her lips. So what I could do is reduce the transparency of my brush to about 20% and then press Enter. And then what I can do is just softly get rid of some of those lines just so they look when it's going over her lips, that in that pinkish hue of her lips, it's not going to be that contrasty of a line on her lip. It may soften it a little bit. And then when I get there and do Command 0, you can see I have a pretty clear displacement of her face. But let's say the displace was off a little bit and I wanted to modify it. You just double click on the Displace filter and then I can modify either my horizontal or vertical scale. But in this case, I believe what my settings were here that I was okay with was 15 by 40. We can give that a try and see what we think and press OK. Grab my displacement map and press open, and then that will commit that displacement. And you can see that's a little bit more severe on the vertical scale, so it kind of modifies it a little bit. But what if I use -40? Let's just experiment with that and move the direction of the displacement in the opposite way, and then press OK. Grab my map, press open. Now you can see when I reversed it, it's a little bit more realistic about going down the bridge of her nose, but at this point I still feel that 40 is a little heavy-handed, so these you can take your time to adjust it. I'm going to take it down to 25, make it a little bit more subtle, and then grab my map and press open. And yeah, 25 is a little bit softer, a little bit more realistic. Okay, so that's using a base image to use an alpha channel, create a displacement map, make adjustments to that alpha channel like we did in this file, and then save that as a displacement map, and then use it with our displacement filter and a layer mask, and then refine the mask as needed once we're done.